So my name's James Campbell. I'm a teacher and a member of a group called Educators for Peace and Justice. I think it's absolutely insane that Canada is doubling down on the global war on terror. For Stephen Harper single-handedly making that decision, yeah, it scares me.
And what do you think about the shootings in Ottawa the other day?
I think many different things. I think the most powerful things that I've read is that it's, for me, a symptom of what's so wrong with a war culture. These are two clearly ill men who were sick, were isolated, had fallen through cracks, and like anyone who's desperate and isolated and floundering, was looking for things to make meaning in their life, and clearly found some self-destructive and violent ideologies to clasp onto. And I think it's so sad that all of the money that this government and past Liberal governments has spent on trying to turn Canada into a new warrior nation could have been spent on trying to build a socially just society with social support networks that would provide the kind of support that these two guys needed. We know just last week that the bombs that are being dropped in Syria and Iraq right now are killing innocent civilians. So we know that Canadian bombs are going to be killing innocent civilians. We know that going into it. In fact, the head of the Canadian Air Force was very explicit to say that they were going to do their best to keep the collateral damage down to a reasonable limit. Well, that's terrifying logic to me. I don't think it's supporting our troops to knowingly send them into situations where they're going to be killing civilians, where we know and that is expected, and where we are asking them to do that job. That's a war crime. We know under the Geneva Conventions that under the laws of war, people, governments, soldiers, militaries have to do absolutely everything in their power to avoid killing civilians. And if there's any chance of killing civilians, that they are not supposed to engage in any action. And yet we have our military leadership willingly and knowingly contravening that principle, those international principles of, quote, the legality of war. I think that is not supporting our troops. I would like to support our soldiers by never putting them in positions where they are going to be victims of violence or victims of war. That's how I would like to support our troops. But we have a government who uses that idea of supporting our troops and uses it to support very narrow neoconservative right-wing ideologies. So they will encourage the yellow stickers, they'll encourage the red poppies as a way to show support, but when it comes down to really supporting our troops, when they come back from war, soldiers are victims of war. And yet when they come back as victims of wars that are created by an elite in Canada who doesn't have to suffer from the impacts of war, our veterans are abandoned. So I think we all need to support our troops, but I think that logic of we can only support our troops in particularly politically useful ways is the height of cynicism and hypocrisy. Nelson Mandela was considered by the United States a terrorist. He was on a no-fly list because he was a terrorist until 2008. So for Stephen Harper to come out and explicitly say, without any information and specifically label what happened in Ottawa and Saint-Jean-sur-Richelieu as terrorist attacks, is purely a political ideological decision. There's nothing factual about that claim. There's very little to indicate that those were intentionally politicized attacks. And yet, once that label gets attached to them, all sorts of things become possible. We don't say that Canadian state violence or the violence of our allies, the United States, is terrorism, when we knowingly are engaged in military actions which terrorize and kill civilians for political ideological reasons. So if our government is willing and able and knows that its violence is harming and killing civilians, We know we're doing it for particular political reasons. If you're actually committed to any kind of universal principles of morality or logic, we then can't avoid applying that label of terrorism to ourselves. We already know that up until 6 months ago, that as far as the Canadian state was concerned, that the most pressing threat against the Canadian state wasn't ISIS sympathizers, wasn't socially isolated people who were looking for some way to justify their own actions. They specifically said the main threat to the Canadian state was environmental activists. So we know what the laws are going to be used to do. When you have incredible organizers, people like Clayton Thomas Mueller, who are on the front lines of trying to save our planet, an indigenous environmental activist who is taking a lead on has for years been taking a lead on the global environmental movement, trying to stop tar sands, when he is being followed by the RCMP, when he's being specifically targeted for his attempt to defend the land for all of us, when people like that are being viewed as security threats and are being presented as the prime security threats, we know what these laws are about. We know what these laws are going to be used for. And that's what really terrifies me about this moment. That we have a government that's willing to stoke racist fear, racist paranoia, and use it for the political purposes of pushing back against Indigenous and environmental activists, pushing back against racialized communities, migrants, people living here without status, different Muslim communities. We've already seen what's been happening out west, the targeting of mosques. We've seen it here in Toronto with the targeting of Muslim candidates for school trustee. We know what those laws are going to be used for, and we know that if anything, those laws aren't going to make us any safer. They're going to make Canadians more vulnerable to the violence of the state, and we know that that violence is primarily directed at Indigenous communities, women, and racialized minorities.